everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Importance of Strategic Clinical Trial Reimbursement Planning During Clinical Research. My name is Becky Johnson, and I'm the Conference Director here at LSX Leaders in London. We have a large portion of our own network joining us today, but also a number of new people to us. So very briefly, I wanted to introduce LSX. LSX stands for Life Science Executives, and we're a community and network of senior life science decision makers across biotech, medtech, and health tech businesses, pharma companies, investors in the healthcare space, as well as payers and providers and other key stakeholders in the healthcare sector. We work to connect our network through digital content, such as today's webinar, digital reports and executive insight, digital roundtables and other formats, as well as through a program of high-level, large-scale conferences, networking, and partnering events. Whilst we gradually make our return to face-to-face events, we're pleased to continue to be able to connect people and share the expertise of our community through digital formats such as this. We're delighted to be working with MCRA, or MCRA, who are a leading advisory firm and CRO for the medical device sector, who have deep industry experience across regulatory, reimbursement, clinical research, healthcare compliance, and quality assurance. Your hosts for today's webinar are Daria Schumann, Senior Director, and Mitali Stevens, Reimbursement Strategy and Evidence Generation at MCRA. Daria has over 10 years in the reimbursement, health economics, and market access space, utilizing her legal and policy background to focus on both contract budget negotiations through MCRA's CRO arm, and also guiding study sponsors through the clinical trial reimbursement arena to ensure appropriate access to coverage and reimbursement during the applicable clinical trial. Mitali brings 20+ years in clinical pharmacy, pharmaceuticals, and medical devices, and provides an industry perspective on developing HERO and market access strategies across all stages of product lifecycle through her prior experiences with Edward Life Sciences, Novo Nordics, Takeda, and other companies. I'd like to ensure we allow a minute or two for any latecomers to join before I hand over to Daria. So a couple of points to mention. First of all, we will have the opportunity at the end of the presentation to answer any questions that any of you may have. So please ask your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And at the end of the presentation, we'll look to answer these. If you have any questions for a specific individual, if you could start the question by referencing who this is directed to so we can best answer it. If you see a question you had in the Q&A already, you can upvote for that question to show you're also interested in the answer. So please do use the question function appropriately. We do want this to be interactive as we possibly can make it. So that's enough from me. Daria, it's over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Becky. Can everyone, well, hopefully you can all see my screen by now. As Becky mentioned, Mitali and I are going to be speaking today about the importance of strategic planning during clinical trials, with a particular focus on evidence generation, evidence development as well. So Becky gave us a kind introduction. We will not reintroduce ourselves, but just know that we are happy to be here to be speaking to all of you. I would like to start by just giving a little bit more information about MCRA for those who don't know us. We are an integrated consulting firm and a CRO. We specialize in various therapeutic areas, expanding more recently into the cardio, neuro, and IBD space, to name a few. And of course, we have sort of our foundation in spine and ortho. And we focus particularly on regulatory, reimbursement, quality, compliance, and clinical. As I mentioned, we have a CRO arm, and we run studies of varying design, scope, and looking at various disease states. So we're going to be covering a lot of ground today, and we're certainly looking forward to your questions. We're going to start with an introduction and overview of what I call CTRS, or Clinical Trial Reimbursement Services. What is it? What does it mean? Why do you need it? Mitali is then going to walk us through the importance of evidence development, something that can be done at various stages of a product life cycle, but again, with a focus on what's going on during the trial. And then we're going to talk about strategic considerations. CTRS and evidence development it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's not a service that makes sense necessarily for every study sponsor or for every client or manufacturer. And we're going to be talking about the things that you have to look at when you're evaluating what services to pursue and whether to pursue them. And then finally, we're going to end with some real-world examples to really show you how the coding, coverage, and payment environment really should help dictate what you pursue, what services you pursue during a trial, so that you can meet your longer-term strategy goals. And as Becky mentioned, we're going to hopefully end about 10 to 15 minutes early to give you an opportunity to ask questions. Okay. So we're going to be talking a lot today about clinical trial reimbursement, obviously, but it's important to kick this off by mentioning that reimbursement and reimbursement challenges can really, I hate to say plague, but plague a technology or challenge a technology across the entire product life cycle. And so the earlier that you can plan for reimbursement, the better. And none of these, the product life cycle is fluid, and each stage sort of informs the other. So again, we're going to be focusing on what you can do during a clinical trial, IDE, IND, to optimize your chances of commercialization success. But what you're doing during your trial does not really exist in a vacuum. You need to consider what the landscape looks like, or your early reimbursement strategy. So understanding the foundation of the technology. What does the coding, coverage, and payment look like? Is there a market? This sort of early planning is critical to the decision-making around CTRS. And then, of course, once you're on the market, what services you pursue, what execution, how do you overcome some of the challenges? And as I mentioned, Mitali is going to be speaking to evidence development. And much like CTRS, the stage of the product lifecycle that you're in really does dictate the strategy you put together around your evidence development plan. So what is CTRS, or Clinical Trial Reimbursement Services? I like to think about this in its most basic form as understanding, when you're a study sponsor running a trial, whether you are going to pay for things or whether there are options for insurance to cover them. And when I say insurance, I of course mean Medicare, Medicaid, private insurance. So what pathways for coverage are available, if any? A lot of our sponsors that we work with at MICRA may not realize that there are in fact pathways for coverage, meaning that insurance can be billed during the trial and very well may cover and pay for various services, including investigational services. So the first part of CTRS is really educating sponsors on what pathways are available, and that depends, and we'll talk more about that. The second piece of that is the site piece. So once a sponsor has made a decision, once they understand the environment and they've made a decision about the services to pursue, then the next step is how do they educate their sites? How do they communicate to their sites what the expectation is? And that's a really critical part of CTRS. Because if a sponsor makes a decision and it's not communicated to the study sites participating in the research, there's a huge disconnect. And often, the notion of billing insurance falls apart if the sites don't understand the expectation. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then finally, we're going to talk about the execution piece. You're running your trial. What can you be looking to collect? How can that serve your longer term reimbursement strategy? So if we start here with this idea of coverage during the trial, I'm going to start by talking about Medicare, which probably isn't surprising. I'm not going to bore you with the history lesson, but I think the takeaway here is that since dating back to the 90s, Medicare has a fairly progressive view on covering investigational services and covering activities that are done during a clinical trial, with of course some parameters around it. But this began back in 1995, where FDA and CMS came together and an interagency agreement was formed, and they decided to work together to categorize devices based on level of risk, and with the goal of giving Medicare patients access to new technologies, which is very progressive. I believe in 2000, HSS put together a national coverage decision, sort of formalizing this process and making clear what CMS would cover. That's NCD 310.1, probably one that most folks on the line are familiar with. It outlines what Medicare will cover during a qualifying clinical trial. And a qualifying clinical trial is not just an IDE. That applies to IND, it applies to post-approval studies, so studies of varying design and scope. That NCD was then revised to be more talk about routine care costs in 2007, and then in 2015, CMS issued new regulations for how to pursue coverage specifically for IDEs. Now, MCRA does a lot of IDE work, and so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is specific to IDE, but I will try to identify where it's not. But Medicare has a long-standing history of collaborating with FDA on this and offering coverage to participants of clinical trials. Now, of course, when we talk about Medicare, we're talking about patients who are over 65 or have certain health conditions. So again, as I mentioned, NCD 310.1 covers or outlines what routine costs in clinical trials will be covered by Medicare. Now, again, to take sort of a step back, a lot of study sponsors, a lot of companies pursuing research don't know that this exists, that this national policy allowing for coverage exists. And so it's our job to make them aware of it and to see if it makes sense for them to pursue it. At its highest level and its most simplest breakdown, Medicare distinguishes between what they call routine care costs and non-routine care costs. Routine care costs are items and services that are provided absent a trial, essentially standard of care services that would be being done anyway. But they also cover services that are required for the provision of the investigational device. So perhaps the insertion of an investigational implant, or the insertion, as a more concrete example, of a single level disc replacement device that's not yet on the market. That implantation, that work, is something that can be billed to the Medicare program and that they in turn should pay for. They also pay for complications, which is a very important point to make. But on the flip side, they don't cover anything that's provided for free, obviously. They don't cover the data-driven activities, so anything that's being done purely for research. As an example, an X-ray at a long-term follow-up time point that's only being done because the protocol requires it, and it's not the doctor's standard of care. That's something Medicare would not pay for. So, the reality is, in most clinical research, there's sort of a split of activities that are research-driven that a sponsor's paying for, and activities that are routine that can be billed to Medicare. If you are running an IDE, there is a very specific process for getting this coverage. It is a process only applicable for IDE, but it's essentially an application. And when we talk about IDEs, we're talking, of course, about category A and B devices. Without going too much into the weeds on that, if you're running an IDE study, your IDE approval letter from FDA will have a categorization on it, category A or category B. Category A studies involve technologies that are considered higher risk or where questions of safety and effectiveness haven't been resolved. You can think of it as the really novel technologies. And in contrast, category B devices are devices that are where questions of safety and effectiveness have been answered. There are often comparable products on the market. So when you are running an IDE study, you will have a categorization on it. And if you want to get coverage from Medicare, there is a very specific process to follow. Now, again, I keep circling back to this, but a lot of companies running research don't know that this pathway exists and don't know how to pursue it necessarily. This is something that a company can do on its own. It's something that MCRA would be able to assist with potentially, but it's essentially an application that goes into CMS, and it shares information about the study, and it does so ideally before you've enrolled any patients. So you've gotten your IDE approval letter, you've hopefully gotten an IRB approval, and in fact, you need an IRB approval, but you put together this packet of information and you send it to the CMS team. It's now a centralized review process as of 2015. You do this before the study starts, and ideally CMS reviews your information, issues you an approval letter, which then means that during your trial, if a Medicare beneficiary enrolls, they can have their services billed to Medicare, and Medicare should pay for those services. I didn't want to go too much into the weeds on what the application looks like, but suffice to say, you do need to submit, there's certain boxes that need to be checked. You need an FDA approval letter for the IDE. You need an IRB approval letter. You need a clinicaltrial.gov number. That's often one of the last pieces that falls into place. And of course, you need a protocol. And then typically you send a request letter to CMS. They have what they call a crosswalk that matches up their criteria with your protocol sections. It essentially makes it easy for them to see that your protocol meets their criteria for coverage, of which there are 10. But this is something that if your patient population in your study is 65 and older, this is a huge benefit to you for a variety of reasons that we'll talk about. But it allows not only offset cost, but it allows you to start using the reimbursement pathways available to you to meet your longer term strategy needs. You essentially become part of the system at this point. And so the Medicare piece I always start with because it is the most transparent, and there is a very specific process for getting coverage. But the reality is that most trials do involve at least a portion of privately insured subjects. And the private insurance landscape for clinical research is a bit more unpredictable. But that doesn't mean that it should be ignored because it is a very critical part of understanding what you can get covered and paid for during your trial. So, when we're talking about private plans, we're of course talking about your Aetnas, Cignas, Humanas. There's over 1,500 private plans, which is overwhelming to a sponsor to think, oh my goodness, how am I gonna project whether all of these plans are gonna pay for or reimburse my procedure? But there are ways to sort of drill down and project what the likelihood of coverage is. Fortunately, the 72 largest plans represent most covered lives. So we do sort of shrink the number of plans we're working with from 1,500 to usually about 70 or 80. But even more than that, we look at site geography. And before I talk about that, I want to mention that, and this is relatively new, most private plans at this point, in response to the Affordable Care Act, have published clinical trial policies. So private health plans maintain medical policies outlining what they will and will not cover, much like Medicare maintains NCDs and LCDs. On the private payer side now, almost all of them have clinical trial policies. So just like Medicare, policies saying what they will and will not cover during a clinical trial. Most of them are publicly available at this point, but most of them are not as progressive as Medicare's. And that's where you run into some stumbling blocks. In response to the Affordable Care Act, a lot of private plans borrowed some of the language indicating that the plan would cover routine care costs, but for trials that were related to cancer treatment or other life-threatening conditions. So that's a big difference. Medicare's policy doesn't make that distinction, doesn't sort of narrow the field. But the majority of private payers have similar language to this, indicating that if your trial is cancer trial or treating a life-saving condition, which is not defined, then they will cover the routine care costs. Now, there are certain other criteria, but that's sort of the big points to make. What this means for elective treatment is sort of unknown. So if you're treating, back pain, whether or not that's life-saving, remains to be determined. But there are some plans out there that will cover a broader use of technologies that do mirror the Medicare policy, essentially, that they cover the routine care costs without narrowing it to cancer or life-saving research. Aetna is a big example of that. That's one of the biggest national plans, United Healthcare as well. So the policy language is really critical to understanding what the likelihood of coverage is from your private payers. And as a sponsor, again, as I said, this can be overwhelming because there's so many plans out there. But the reality is, if you know your sites and you know where your sites are located, there are ways to project what your likelihood of coverage is by looking at the payer mix in that individual location. Payer penetration data is available. It's something that MCRA does have access to. And what it tells you is, and you can see here, in Alabama, for example, 40% of covered lives of people with insurance are represented by BCBS Alabama. 10% are represented by Medicare. So if you know who the top payers are, the top 4 or 5, you're looking at, I can do some quick math. I mean, right there, that's almost 80% of covered lives in the state of Alabama. So you can project what, are your top 4 payers all restrictive? Are they all private payers who say we only cover cancer research? Or are they Aetna's, United Healthcare, Medicare, where you get, green color coding, obvious color coding, but essentially coverage of routine care costs. And so helping a sponsor understand this based on where their sites are located can help them financially project what they're going to have to pay for versus what they're going to build to, get successfully billed to insurance, which will allow them to make a decision about whether to pursue this path. Do we want to bill insurance? Do we want to go this route? Or do we want to simply pay for everything? Because that's always an option during a trial as a sponsor, paying directly for the procedure. So this allows them to make an informed decision, or it allows them to, internally project their own costs. If we're not going to get coverage, then how much are we going to have to pay for these surgeries? And it could also be a factor in site selection. If all other things considered, it's something to look at. Is this a really challenging environment? That can help a sponsor weed out a site. So it's an important thing to evaluate strategically, in addition to, of course, the Medicare piece, understanding what your likelihood of private payer coverage is as a first step. Now, we're going to segue into site education. So at this point, we have helped a sponsor understand what their pathways are. Hopefully they've made a decision. Do they want to pursue coverage and reimbursement, or do they want to pay for everything? If a site wants to bill insurance, if a sponsor wants to bill insurance during the trial, as I said, the next step is to make sure the sites understand that. Now, this site education is not as important if a sponsor's paying for everything. But if they're going to be asked to bill insurance, there's a very specific way to do that, especially for Medicare. And we recommend making sure sites are aware of that, because ultimately, if a site is successful, the study will be successful, the sponsor will be successful, everything will run more smoothly. And so site education materials can be in the form of billing guides, template pre-authorization letters, coding guides that outline how to report a clinical trial. We could do a whole webinar on just that topic. But the takeaway really is that the sites need to understand what the expectation is and what the process is. And that can look like resource development, or it can even look like individual site trainings, which is something we've certainly done as part of an SIV, site initiation visit. We train the site on what to do, meaning how to report this as a trial, where to put the clinical trial number, compliantly, of course, but making the resources available to them so that they can succeed. And then finally, assuming you're running a trial and you're billing insurance, there is an opportunity to collect really valuable data in the form of those claim forms and those EOBs, explanation of benefits, that come back. And this is something that, depending on the environment for a technology, this is something that can be really critical to a company's longer-term reimbursement strategy. Collecting this data compliantly, of course, in a redacted form, shows you essentially the coding used, the charges, the payments made, and the payers. It tells you who is paying what. It allows you to track code utilization, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But there could be very important reasons for collecting this intel, and it is very important intel. I will say it's hard to access. A lot of sites are reluctant to share it. Of course, we always redact everything, but it is difficult to get, but it is very valuable information to get. And not the least of which is collecting that cost data allows a company to make an economic argument for their technology. So we're not just looking at clinical benefit through running the study, but we're potentially making a health economic argument, which may be part of a company's evidence development strategy, making that cost effectiveness argument. So at this point, I am going to turn it over to Mitali to talk about the importance of evidence development. Mitali,
thank you. Thanks, Daria. Very nicely done. So how do you know actually what to collect, what to develop, and actually, to Daria's point earlier, what to actually include into the protocol? Well, it starts with how you think about the evidence. Not only is it helpful with clinical trial reimbursement, as Daria just mentioned, but it can also help you secure that permanent coverage later on. So the goal of developing evidence is really to turn information, which are these random dots, into actual knowledge, something that actually makes sense. Data is really everywhere, and only when you can ask the right questions, guided by the key functions such as regulatory questions, clinical questions, reimbursement, market access questions, can all of these random pieces of information be really turned into something of value that the decision makers can then use to get either regulatory approvals or payer coverage, and then subsequently your market adoption. So when you have these uncoordinated efforts, you continue to see these dots and you collect the information during your clinical trial without really understanding how each one is actually interrelated. So the goal here is for all the different functions to work together, collect information that really helps the companies make sense of the unknown and actually helps the stakeholders help make sense of the unknown. So on the next slide, you will see that in addition to clinical trials, there are now many other opportunities that exist to collect data and develop evidence beyond that safety and efficacy. There are also a lot more hurdles to overcome with these various stakeholders. So the earlier you can start thinking about evidence with the goals of reimbursement and market adoption in mind, the better you can then incorporate the endpoints into the clinical trials and such, and really maximize your investments to help everyone connect the dots in the development phase, which is earlier on in the game. And this will naturally create the knowledge to drive better communication, decision-making during the clinical trial reimbursement phase, but also into the mature phases of the product lifecycle. So when it comes to reimbursement, you'll see that on the next slide, it's a really long process. It takes anywhere from 5 to 7 years. And there are many companies that are still dealing with payer coverage issues long after their regulatory approvals. Now, there are, of course, many other components at play here when it comes to the full reimbursement picture. There's coding, then there's a specialty society support needs. And then in order to get permanent coding and payment assignment, there are some stringent requirements in place that will need to be fulfilled that we'll take a look at a little bit later. And all of them are really driven by specific evidence needs. On the next slide, these are the top key players that will need to see the demonstration of value and affordability from a reimbursement and market adoption perspective. And closing that gap by navigating earlier through their complex evidentiary needs can really help to set up the success of that product launch. So let's take a very brief look at what each of these stakeholders actually care about. So regulatory bodies like the FDA in the US care about whether the product is safe, does it actually do what it claims it does? However, FDA clearance or approval does not actually guarantee coverage. And you'll see that on the next slide why that is the case. Payers, commercial, Medicare, they need more substantial evidence, and they require that substantial evidence in order to help make those appropriate coverage decision making. They just follow a very different recipe than the FDA and care about how the product actually impacts health outcomes. They carefully evaluate sound scientific evidence to really understand what that clinical utility is of that product in the real world setting, outside of the randomized controlled, very controlled trials. And they really care about what the results of the studies are translating into patient benefits. And oftentimes these studies, they are larger in nature and they have more outcomes-based endpoints. And so Daria has on the screen right now the providers, and the providers are very similar in mindset to the payers, except that they layer in more information. They also try to look at benefits versus established alternatives. They layer in the cost to facility. They also look at the strong physician demand. If there's no market that's created in advance of the product launch, and if the providers are not actually asking for the product, it becomes very difficult for those value analysis committees to actually put and purchase the product for their hospitals. So these studies such as burden of illness and others that really establish the unmet need are very critical convincing factors for this set of stakeholders. And then lastly, you'll see a bunch of different stakeholders kind of clumped into one. We have the associations, the societies, and then the patients. These last three sets of stakeholders, they play a key role when, again, establishing the unmet need, but also developing those position statements and practice guidelines that the payers and providers look to in understanding where a product fits into a care pathway for their patients. Additionally, the coding. Now, Daria mentioned coding is quite complicated. It's hard to get to. Nobody wants to give that information away. But the coding development process actually enlists the support of specialty societies along with the key evidence thresholds specifically laid out. And they say they require 5 peer-reviewed publications. Now, not all are 5 RCTs, but you can collect some of the meaningful information in that original RCT that may have gotten payment for and reimbursement for. And that way you have an opportunity to actually tap into that data to fulfill some of these requirements laid out. At the end of the day, all these different stakeholders, they rely on published data in peer-reviewed articles to really support their decision-making. So in the next slide, here are some best practices for really developing the right evidence for the right stakeholders and potentially getting your clinical trial reimbursed and hopefully securing that permanent coverage in place later on. So it can be broken down into 4 main stages. The first phase is internal alignment. You have to have internal alignment with regulatory and commercial goals. And then it's critical to deciding what that level of evidence is needed. Only after this has been thoroughly laid out that you move on to really identifying, doing lit searches and sweeping the corners to see what currently exists out there to help support that business case. When you get to the point where you have to do a clinical study, having the answers to what your stakeholders need through primary research, so actually go out there, talk to payers, talk to providers, see what they want, and then you can avoid some of that duplication of your budgetary spend and potentially actually reducing your timelines. Now, the second phase, once you've understood your goals and what currently exists out there through lit searches, it involves laying out what you have found and matching it to your aspirational value messages to really see where you're sufficient in evidence and where you're lacking and where you need to be to support your goals. And those goals, it's best to lay them out from a company's perspective, but also listening to what those stakeholders were saying along your primary research efforts and really confirm the gaps where you have found in your evidentiary needs. The third phase, following the first two phases, which, the first two phases actually are very, very critical in understanding the gaps. And by the time you get to phase number 3, this is probably the most tasking in terms of time and budget. And it really involves thinking through your research needs. Laying out what that publication plan might be looking like and assessing the feasibility of research. Can you do any of the research through the clinical study, or is there an opportunity to collect data and then later on do real world evidence around it? It's an amazing place to be in phase 3, but it is a lot of work. But once you have that plan laid out, go ahead and get your research team in place and get that research done. And if you can get reimbursement for that research along the way, that's just really cherry on top. And that's where the CTRS actually comes in. And finally, phase number 4, this is probably one of my favorite phases after phase number 3. It's the fun part of taking that complicated scientific literature that you've just generated to really take that information, digest it, simplify it so that your stakeholders can understand it. So you can develop communication tools such as posters, publications, dossiers, slide decks, and those economic calculators are very beneficial as well. The other part of phase number 4 is going to be that feedback loop. And that feedback loop is very, very critical to really understanding and continuing to fill those gaps so that you can continue to create the substantial clinical evidence to help you move forward through the product life cycle. And when you go through this process, it really allows companies to uncover what evidence may be needed to demonstrate value for each of the key stakeholders. And so if you're going to get reimbursement for your study, you might as well maximize that investment through fulfilling the needs of multiple stakeholders. And now with this little bit of knowledge and hopefully a streamlined process of how you develop evidence, how you think about evidence, let's get back to the broader strategy and the CTRS. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Daria.
Thank you. Thanks, Mitali. You mentioned something a few times as you were going through that about understanding your goals, and that is critical for making a decision about whether to pursue CTRS. Hopefully by now you've got a high level understanding of what services exist, coverage, educating your sites, preparing resources, looking at the private payer and Medicare landscape. But not every study needs to pursue CTRS. And so sort of understanding the big picture is critical. And in order to do that, you really ideally need to understand the longer term reimbursement strategy. So it's not a one size fits all approach. We don't have it's not every client or every sponsor that I say, yes, you need to bill Medicare during your study. It's a very tailored assessment of not only that study, but also that technology's reimbursement environment. And that starts, and this is where, I circle back to this product lifecycle slide. We're talking about what happens here during the trial, but that is informed by this early strategy. And that gives you the foundation for deciding what to pursue during your trial. And then ideally, so that you can optimize your commercialization and market access success. When we have a new client who comes to us and we're looking at whether to pursue CTRS, we always go back to the basics: coding, coverage, and payment. Ideally, this is information that we have available to us through a reimbursement landscape. So something that I would collaborate with my colleagues on to understand what the environment looks like for that technology, for that disease state. So really, it is a back to the basics sort of assessment. And these are the types of questions that we ask. And these are the types of questions you should be considering when you're evaluating whether to pursue CTRS, whether to try to bill insurance, whether to educate your sites, whether to try to collect claims data and economic data. It's pretty simple. Is there a code? Is there a way to report this procedure? Is there coverage outside of a trial? We talked about clinical trial policies already, but the reality is that a lot of these technologies have standalone medical policies. So is this a procedure that is well covered outside of a trial, or is it so novel that there's not even policies yet? Often when that's the case, on the private payer side, technologies like that get negative treatment. Does the sponsor want to bill insurance? That's a bit of a loaded question. Financially, it's a financial decision, but it also impacts enrollment, and that's just a reality. Billing insurance can be a challenge. Patients are sometimes reluctant to have copays and deductibles. This is the environment we live in today. So it has to be a business decision. Is this something the sponsor even wants to consider doing, or do they want to pay for everything so that they could get their trial enrolled arguably more quickly? What is the study design? And that sort of triggers a whole host of additional questions. And last but not least, you have to look at the market. Is this a saturated market? Is there even a market for this technology? And when we talk about the real world examples in just a few minutes, I'll show you what I mean by that. But the study design consideration is an important issue to really closely look at. And these are the types of things to evaluate. Is the trial blinded? I cannot tell you how many times we've gotten sponsors tripped up on this. If it's a blinded trial and you are billing insurance, there is a very high likelihood that your patients will become unblinded because they will see their EOBs and they will see what procedures they had done. And so there are, in some instances, ways around that. But it is something to be very, very aware of. Is the trial randomized? Do we know what procedure the patient's getting, or are we not finding out until they're wheeled into the OR? That can really impact how you pre-authorize or try to get coverage beforehand for a procedure. If it could be one of two things, you have to be transparent about that. So you have to plan for that. And then, of course, you have, single arm versus studies that have a control. We can't ignore what happens with the control during a trial. So I say, I throw these questions out there not to bombard you, but to make you aware that this is a careful evaluation that needs to be done when you're helping a company understand whether to pursue this service, or if you're a sponsor, making that decision. And I really do, want to emphasize that it's not one size fits all by any means. So I want to end with, I know I'd like to give 10 minutes for questions. 2 real world examples. Both involve a single arm IDE, so investigational device, involving a spine implant. So, very similar study design, non-randomized, no active control. But in the first case example, we have a well-covered spine implant. And in the second, we have a very novel spine implant. So I want to show you how the reimbursement environment for a technology can really determine what a sponsor pursues and how they run their study. So for case study 1, there is a code. There's a code to report the procedure. The procedure is well covered outside of a trial, and the payment is sufficient. So there's not a need to make an argument for reclassification to a higher paying code. Everyone's happy outside of a trial. So, and probably not surprisingly, the market for this type of technology is fairly saturated. There are comparable products already on the market. So what does that mean for the trial? Well, this sponsor has no reason to track a code and establish volume. They have no reason to establish a coverage precedence during their trial or identify early payer adopters. It's already covered. And so this sponsor chose to just pay for the investigational surgery. They said, we're not going to go through billing insurance. Obviously that saves us money, but we want this study enrolled fast. And so they just paid for everything because they didn't have a challenging environment ahead of them from a reimbursement perspective. What they did have, however, was an argument to be made for why a hospital should buy their device versus another, because again, it's a saturated market. And so we got creative with them. And, had they pursued billing insurance, they would have been able to collect the claims data, but they didn't. And so they wanted still, if they could, to collect economic data so that they could tell an economic story about why their device was more cost effective than a comparable product. And so what we did was we worked with them to collect economic data on their CRFs, on their case report forms. We collected OR time, we collected complication data with coding. We of course looked at setting of care. And so all of this, they were still able to collect data and do it in a creative way and make an argument for why, make a cost effectiveness argument, tell an economic story. So that addressed the issue of the saturated market. In contrast, where we have, again, single arm IDE, spine implant, but novel, it's so different how this sponsor elected to proceed. There was no established coding. There was no compliant way to report this, nothing that existed that could be used, which meant unlisted code and in the pursuit of eventually their own code. No coverage, nothing like this on the market. First of its kind, no coverage policies, Medicare payment unknown. We're looking at an unlisted code during their trial. Now, this sponsor essentially needs to look at establishing a coverage precedence, needs to look at who's paying, is anyone paying, is Medicare paying? They need to look at code tracking because eventually they're going to have to move towards a permanent CPT code for their, to report their technology. So they have a real need to bill insurance, even though they're using an unlisted code and it's probably going to be a challenge. They elected to have their sites bill insurance, and in fact required it. So that means, if your sites are billing insurance, they sought CMS approval. They looked at the private payer landscape. They developed resources for their sites. They sort of did everything because even though they knew it would probably be faster to just pay for everything themselves as sponsor, they knew that if they did that, they were sort of shooting themselves in the foot from a long-term reimbursement strategy perspective. The trial was an excellent opportunity for them to collect that data, to see what payers were covering the technology, to look at code utilization and volume. And so they made the difficult choice. This is sort of an extreme example because we don't have any coverage, coding, or payment, but they made this decision to serve their longer-term needs so that ideally, once they are approved and on the market, they will have a better, they will have already taken the steps and built the foundation for getting their own code, for working with health plans to secure coverage and positive coverage policies. This sort of dichotomy really does emphasize to me that, that you need to look carefully at all of the reimbursement factors and at the study design. And, you know, it's not, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, I guess is what I should say. You know, this is part of a bigger story, and it's a difficult choice as a sponsor to make sometimes, but it's one that ultimately benefits you if it makes sense to pursue these services. The goal is to benefit you long-term so that you're not on the market with no coding, no coverage, no payment. You know, you've got an opportunity to build that foundation, and the study is an excellent time to do that. So that's where we end for today. Thank you everyone for joining. Becky, it does look like we have 10 minutes for questions.
Yeah, we do have a question at the moment, which is great. So the first question that we have is, first of all, thank you for these great insights. So clearly being enjoyed. The question is there a similar program for Medicaid population?
That's a great question. So the Medicaid population, there was recent legislation enacted last year, actually, that essentially mirrored the language around life-threatening conditions. So, you know, Medicaid is state-run, and previously it was a bit of a quagmire to navigate what Medicaid state entity was paying for what. But now there's been legislation enacted. It's called the Clinical Trial Policy, I believe. That does mandate coverage of routine care costs for life-threatening conditions or for cancer research. So that is, believe it or not, more coverage than I think we previously had. Historically, the Medicaid program did not cover much clinical research, but there is not a proactive process like there is for Medicare. So it's sort of, I think, can be equated to the private payer landscape, where you're looking at case-by-case coverage versus you're not submitting an application beforehand like you do with Medicare. So hopefully that answers your question.
Perfect, thank you. I think we've just got another question that's just come in. This is from an anonymous attendee. What about trials that are testing a new device? So the reimbursement would have to be for an HCPS code, not a CPT code.
So sure. So that's a really good question. When we're talking about device, we're talking about likely a device that's received category A or B designation. And so the physician is, of course, reporting his or her work with CPT codes. The hospital reports the HCPCS code. There are very specific ways to report. If you're involved in a device, there's a particular HCPCS code to report an investigational device. But how you report a device and whether it's covered depends on whether it's received a category A or a category B designation. So I'm going to assume we're talking about IDE here, which I think is a safe assumption. If you've gotten a category A device, you cannot bill for the device. So there would be no HCPCS code to report. If you have received a category B designation from FDA on your IDE letter, then the device can be billed to Medicare. And that is where you would report, the facility, the hospital would report the HCPCS code along with the other required information to report it as a trial. And so long as that sponsor has obtained CMS approval for the study, the Medicare program should pay for the category B device.
Perfect. That sounded very well explained to me. I'm not gonna lie, I didn't entirely understand the question or the answer, but hopefully that answered that question.
I hope it did. If it didn't, follow up with me.
So we do have a few more minutes. I'll just allow sort of a couple more minutes for sort of any other questions to come in. But before we wrap things up, so I've got a sort of a question sort of my own, I guess. So I mean, Daria, do payers have a preference on a particular study type for coverage evaluations? I don't know if you can sort of shed any light on that.
That's a very good question, Becky. So I will say this, you know, when a technology is on the market, At that point, payers want to see the highest quality data they can to support coverage, meaning they like RCTs, they like prospective randomized trials. Those are sort of the gold standard for a lot of health plans. It's just the reality that we're in. When you're running I'm trying to distinguish between, what happens, how payers view studies, one, the technology is already on the market, versus during a trial, and you're making an argument for why the payer should cover the study services in real time. Medicare has a progressive policy. I wouldn't say that they have any sort of preference. As long as you fit their criteria, they'll cover the routine care costs. Private payers, it's a bit of a mixed bag. A lot of private payers will not cover your study unless you are treating cancer or a life-threatening condition. So that's where that language does become very impactful. If it's an elective surgery, a lot of private payers will say, this is not life-threatening, we are not covering this, we're not going to pay for it. And then you're left with a denied claim, potentially.
Okay, perfect. Expanded my horizons. Thank you for that.
Sure.
We've got a follow-up on the device question, again from anonymous attendee, so I'm presuming the same person.
I didn't answer it the first time. Sorry.
I was wondering specifically about reimbursement of durable medical equipment or orthotics/prosthetics for home use.
Oh, okay.
Very niche.
Yes, I'm not going to lie, I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I apologize. DME is sort of its own world. I know Medicare has policies on it. I'd have to look at how those interact. So I have to punt on that question. I'm sorry. I am sorry.
That's fine. I mean, what I was going to, obviously it's been anonymously asked. So whoever asked the question, perhaps, reach out to Daria sort of after this. And, I'm sure Daria or one of your colleagues, whoever's most appropriate, will obviously do their best to answer the question for you. So, so whoever that is, that's my suggestion. So we've got literally sort of 3 minutes left. So if anyone wants to pop in a really quick question, I can put it to Daria. But if not, then sort of we'll wrap up. So I'll just leave sort of a couple more seconds. No, it doesn't seem we've got any more, but Daria, obviously thank you so much for joining us, and Natalia as well, obviously, in the background. A huge thank you, for sharing your expertise. It's been really insightful. Again, happy, I'm sure, to take sort of questions off obviously, a more public stage, so do reach out to them. To mention, we are also delighted to continue our partnership with MUCRA at our flagship event, World Congress in 2022. This will be a return to a physical event live in London, UK. So for anyone interested in finding out more about the event and obviously MUCRA's involvement, please do get in touch with myself at LSX or the wider team, or indeed MUCRA directly, and perhaps we'd actually be able to meet face to face rather than through a computer screen. But thank you once again, and several people are saying thank you as well on the Q&A. So, but that's it for obviously today's webinar and from myself. So until next time, so thank you and goodbye to everyone. Thank you so much.